Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. Yesterday we had a fairly cautiously optimistic video as China showed signs of finally opening up. Today we start with the economy and we are reminded once again of the pressure zero COVID has put on the economic dynamism of the country, fallout which will likely remain some time after the policy is ultimately repealed. This week we received the Caixin China General Services Business Activity Index, which seeks to give an independent snapshot of operating conditions and services industries like retail and travel, which in of themselves are very good proxies for household demand. According to the services PMI, China's services activity contracted for the third straight month in November, hitting a 6-month low, dropping to 46.7 from 48.4 in October. We remember that a number above 50 indicates an expansion in activity, while a figure below signals a contraction. This sustained contraction in services follows the trend we observed last week in China's industrial sector, with the Caixin China Manufacturing PMI for November showing 49.4, the fourth consecutive month of contraction. The China General Composite PMI, which covers both the manufacturing and services sectors, fell to 47 from 48.3 in October. Wang Zhe, the senior economist of Caixin Insight Group, which puts the index together, expressed what we already know. Quote, "The prolonged pandemic has battered the economy." End quote. According to the index's findings, business confidence among services companies dropped to an 8-month low in November and remained below the long-term average. Quote, "The downturn in employment coupled with the triple pressure, shrinking demand, supply shocks and weakening expectations have created a negative feedback loop. The market is in urgent need of policies to promote employment and stabilize domestic demand. Beijing should further coordinate fiscal and monetary policies to expand domestic demand and boost incomes of the poorer parts of the population." End quote. This, of course, is easier said than done. Increasing demand has long been a priority for Beijing policymakers, but most policy responses have been on the supply side. There are many reasons for this, not the least being the powerful role in the decision-making process of vested interests on the supply side. And indeed, these last few years, rebalancing towards demand has seen some reversals. According to a recently published China Macroeconomy Forum study, during the period of COVID, wage growth for high and middle income groups dropped from 8% to 4%, while wage growth for low income groups, representing hundreds of millions of people, dropped from 8% to 0%. This is significant. Quote, "Wages growing more slowly than GDP is the equivalent of an income transfer from workers to subsidize government and business spending. Not only has the growth rate of total production declined, but workers are getting a lower share of what they produce. This, along with an increase in desired savings driven by higher job insecurity, is the main reason that domestic demand has failed to keep up, even with weak growth in domestic production." End quote. And speaking of production and moving on to our last development for the economy, the US-based Wall Street Journal reports that in recent weeks, Apple Inc. has accelerated plans to shift some of its production outside of China. According to unnamed sources, it has been telling suppliers to plan more activity for assembling Apple products elsewhere in Asia, particularly India and Vietnam, and looking to reduce dependence on Taiwanese assemblers led by Foxconn Technology Group. The transition is already underway and has been driven by two causes, according to the outlet, that are feeding into each other. Some Chinese youth are no longer eager to work for modest wages assembling electronics. The other factor is, quote, "Beijing's heavy-handed COVID-19 approach, itself a concern for Apple and many other Western companies." End quote. Next up, the quote of the week, and for the quote of the week in today's video, we have part of General Secretary Xi Jinping's speech during the recent memorial service for the late PRC leader Jiang Zemin. The quote speaks for itself. Quote, "In the late spring and early summer of 1989, a severe political disturbance took place in China. Comrade Jiang Zemin resolutely upheld and implemented the CPC Central Committee's correct decision on taking a clear stand against the turmoil, defending China's socialist state power and safeguarding the fundamental interests of the people." End quote. Okay, next up, the national COVID situation, and we have yet more signs of accelerated opening up. The sensitive capital, Beijing, has now dropped many of its tight measures. Residents of the city are now allowed into parks, supermarkets and offices without a negative COVID-19 test starting from yesterday, Tuesday. Critically, Beijing Capital Airport has also dropped the requirement of presenting a negative COVID test in order to enter. State media reports yesterday that 4 new COVID vaccines have been approved for emergency use over a matter of days, and that authorities are making plans to kick off a national push for a 4th dose of the domestically produced vaccine. State-run Global Times admits that there is some degree of vaccine hesitancy among elderly groups and even among medical workers. We are also seeing reports of local authorities in major cities like Guangzhou preparing for surges in cases, suggesting a firm policy shift from eradication to opening. One health official in Guangzhou, speaking to UK-based Financial Times, for example, expressed, quote, "One of our biggest challenges is how hospitals cope with the surge in infections among doctors and nurses," end quote, adding that the city would discourage its millions of migrant workers from returning to their hometowns for next month's Lunar New Year. Several districts in Guangzhou have also issued guidelines to residents for dealing with COVID, including advising that residents should stay at home if they have symptoms and to start with an online consultation rather than going to the hospital. This is a radical departure from just over a week ago, when symptoms could result in being sent to a centralized quarantine facility. State media too has largely maintained its narrative shift towards COVID normalization, which we examined yesterday. On Tuesday, for example, state-run CGTN ran a report on just how mild COVID cases are now in many cities. The piece quotes the head of Guangzhou Medical University as expressing, quote, "Therefore, I think the virulence of the Omicron subvariants is obviously weakening, which is very close to seasonal flu. It's now a disease that can be prevented, controlled, and treated." End quote. Again, quite a radical shift in messaging from only a few weeks ago. There are also signs that many localities are dismantling COVID testing capacity. This week alone, hospitals in various provincial-level regions, including Anhui, Guangdong, Guangxi, Sichuan, and Tianjin, have announced that their COVID testing sites will no longer be open to the public. We will likely see this trend continue in the following days. Now, these are all optimistic signs, but we must stress, like yesterday, that much of the national zero-COVID policy apparatus still remains in place, and there remains the possibilities that either 1. Beijing pulls back from easing efforts and retightens restrictions, or 2. Easing is only permitted in wealthier cities at first, a possibility we discussed in yesterday's video. We must continue to follow these developments in the coming weeks. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button. I've also heard from several of you guys in recent days that you've been unsubscribed to China Update without you knowing about it. If you believe that you should be subscribed to the channel, it may be worth checking this now, just in case YouTube, for whatever reason, has unsubscribed you. As always, anyone who wants to go that extra mile too and help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. And finally, for today's video, the housing crisis, and in a move which analysts believe indicates that policymakers have realized that too many real estate firms defaulting on offshore debt is not good for foreign investor confidence, China's financial regulators recently loosened restrictions on the lending mechanism to encourage banks to offer loans to overseas branches of property firms, many of whom are struggling to repay their US dollar bonds. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes that the mechanism allows a property firm on the Chinese mainland to apply for financing guarantees from a domestic bank, quote, thus enabling their overseas units to apply for a loan from offshore branches of the bank, end quote. Meanwhile, Chinese financial media outlet Yicai reports that developers are rushing to sell shares with the new policy easing we have seen in recent weeks. The outlet writes that 15 Chinese publicly traded property developers have disclosed plans to sell new shares since China's security regulator eased restrictions, which we covered at the time. Quote, the developers said that they would use the proceeds to complete construction of projects, replenish liquidity, and repay debts, end quote. 6 of the 15 developers are state-owned enterprises or controlled directly by state-owned businesses. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been poured into resuscitating developers in the property sector in the last few weeks, but as we continue to stress, the demand side of the industry remains bruised and battered. The housing crisis is certainly not over. It has merely entered a new stage. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful day wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.